The night air in Ikoyi was heavy with the kind of silence that warned of storms, though no clouds gathered above the marble-walled mansion. Inside, where chandeliers glittered and guards patrolled with measured footsteps, Cathy Anderson sat in her study, going over figures that meant progress for hundreds of young girls across Lagos, while her husband, Tonny, lounged across the hall with a glass of brandy and a smile that looked warm but never reached his eyes. And somewhere between them, hidden in the edges of the house like a shadow that cleaned and carried without being seen, Zainab, the new maid, polished the stair rails, her ears tuned to the strange pulse of the home. She had learned early that wealthy houses had two kinds of quiet, the safe quiet of peace and the dangerous quiet of secrets. And on this night, the second kind was humming, low and steady, as though the marble itself held its breath. Cathy, known throughout the city as the billionaire who built schools, scholarships, and clinics, was respected and admired, but her flaw was the trust she carried like jewelry. She believed that those closest to her shared her vision of light, never suspecting that betrayal could sit across the table with a smile. Tonny, meanwhile, had grown restless with being introduced as the husband of Cathy, restless with standing in the shadow of a woman whose name stirred more admiration than his, and in the shadows of that restlessness, greed and envy brewed like bitter palm wine. Zainab had come to the mansion only a month before, carrying little more than a threadbare bag and her mother's words that honesty keeps the door open, even for the poor. And she was determined to serve quietly, to earn her pay, and to stay invisible. But that was before she found the napkin under Tonny's tumbler in the study. A napkin folded as if it were just another careless scrap, except that it bore 3 words written in hurried ink: "Don't talk." Those words bit into her mind, sharp and heavy, because they were not instructions for a party guest or a servant. They pulsed with menace, as if meant for someone who had already seen too much. Zainab slipped the napkin into her apron, heart racing, and forced her hands to keep polishing while Tonny walked in whistling softly, his suit jacket undone, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. He glanced at her, let his eyes linger, and said in that smooth tone of his, "You're new here, aren't you? New people often don't know the rules." Zainab lowered her eyes, whispering, "Yes, sir," and he chuckled as he poured himself another drink, muttering almost to himself, "And learn fast." The house seemed to shiver with his words, and when he left, the dangerous silence returned, thicker than before. Later that evening, Cathy crossed the hall to kiss her husband goodnight, unaware of the bitter storm swelling behind his charm, unaware that her own maid now carried a secret note that felt heavier than any broom or bucket. And as Zainab lay on her thin mattress in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling fan as it chopped the humid air into restless currents, she kept hearing the warning in her head, "Don't talk." She wondered who wrote it and why. Was it a threat to Cathy, a reminder to Tonny, or a warning left behind by another staff member who had already vanished into the city? Her heart knew one thing with certainty. This mansion was not just marble and roses. It was a stage where something dangerous was rehearsing, and she was already in the audience, whether she wanted to or not.
Morning arrived with the blaze of Lagos sun pouring through the mansion's tall windows. And from the garden fountains to the polished tiles, everything sparkled as if the world outside the gates, traffic, dust, sweat, did not exist. But inside, Zainab moved quietly with a broom, her body bent and her ears alert, because she had not forgotten the napkin from last night and the way Tonny's words dripped like oil. Cathy was already awake, wearing a soft lilac dress, her braids tied neatly, her eyes glowing with the same quiet determination that had built schools in Surulere and funded scholarships in Yaba. And she sat at her desk speaking to her assistant Folu about a launch scheduled for Friday, a robotics program for underprivileged girls, a project she called her Forest of Futures. Fulu nodded eagerly, taking notes, while Cathy reminded her, "No delays, Folu. These girls are waiting. We promised them." And her voice carried such warmth that even the maids lingering by the doorway felt a spark of hope. But Tonny stood in the corner, pretending to scroll through his phone, his eyes half closed, listening more than he appeared. And Zainab noticed the flicker of irritation cross his face whenever Cathy mentioned girls, education, or her dream of raising leaders, as though each word were a thorn pressed into his pride. At lunch in the staff quarters, Auntie Grace leaned close to Zainab and whispered, "Child, don't forget, the master's husband smiles with his teeth only. Keep your head low." And the advice curled around Zainab's heart like smoke, but she could not shake the memory of the napkin. Later, as she gathered laundry from the guest suite, she heard voices through the thin connecting door. Tony's smooth tone and another man's clipped accent, each word dropping like stones in a well. "Tonight's test run, a microdose, watch her pulse." The stranger's reply was calm. "And if it works?" Tonny chuckled. "Friday, the full measure. No screaming, no mess, just grief." Glass clinked, silence stretched, and then both men laughed, a laugh too cold for the marble walls. Zainab's blood turned to ice. Poison? Tonight, a test. Friday, the launch. She backed away, heart pounding, but the door handle jiggled and panic gripped her. She darted into the linen closet, shut herself into the smell of starch and soap, and pressed her hand against her mouth as footsteps approached, paused, and continued down the hall. Her pulse beat like a drum in her ears. When at last the hall fell quiet, she slid out, trembling, and the napkin's warning blazed fresh in her mind. "Don't talk." Now she understood. It wasn't just a threat, it was a strategy, a command meant to keep truth buried while danger grew. As night wrapped the mansion in silence, Zainab lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, every sound magnified. The creak of pipes, the rustle of curtains, the faint knock of Tony's shoes on marble. And she whispered to herself, "If I stay quiet, she will die. If I speak, I might be the one buried." The fan blade sliced the air, the silence hummed, and the house itself seemed to wait, listening to the choice only she could make.
By the time dawn broke on the second day, Zainab's fear had sharpened into something heavier than silence. It had become suspicion, a careful eye that caught details other staff missed, because once you've heard the whisper of poison, you start seeing danger in every cup. She began to collect proof, the way a sparrow gathers straws, small pieces that could weave into something strong enough to carry weight. So when Tonny strolled into the kitchen whistling, offering to take Cathy's evening tea upstairs, Zainab noticed the way his hand lingered a fraction too long over the porcelain cup, fingers twitching like a man rehearsing a trick. And later, when the cup came back half-finished, she pretended to wash it, but instead slipped the tarnished sensitive silver spoon into the dregs. And when the spoon's tip darkened ever so slightly, her stomach lurched. Confirmation, but not yet evidence. Still, she washed it quickly and returned it gleaming, heart pounding at the thought that one careless movement could reveal her watchfulness. She remembered her mother's saying that you don't need big weapons to fight monsters, only your eyes and the right questions. What changed? Who gains? And what can't survive sunlight? And Zainab found herself whispering those questions like prayers as she moved through the mansion, watching how Folu flinched whenever Tonny entered the room, how Cathy's smile stayed steady though her husband's shadow dimmed her glow, how certain guests came and went with faces too smooth, greetings too clipped. One evening she crept back into Tonny's study under the guise of polishing shelves, and there she compared the napkin's hurried handwriting with the bold signatures on his desk. The scrawls did not match, which meant someone else had written, "Don't talk," either as a warning to her or as an order to another accomplice. And the mystery deepened like a well with no bottom.
Fear told her to leave the mansion, to run back to the noisy safety of a jegunle, where danger came in daylight and not wrapped in silk curtains. But something stronger than fear made her stay. A sense that if Cathy fell, hundreds of girls would fall too, robbed of the future Cathy was building. That night she whispered into her cracked old phone, recording a voice memo with trembling lips. "If anything happens to me, Tonny Anderson is planning harm against Madam Cathy. He spoke of microdoses, of Friday, of grief. I swear I am not lying." She slid the phone into a tissue box in the pantry, praying the small device could one day speak if she no longer could. Later, when Cathy passed through the hall, tired but still radiant, Zainab's resolve hardened. She could not carry the silence alone any longer. She would have to risk speaking, even if it meant losing her place in this golden prison. As the mansion settled into sleep, its marble veins humming with secrets, Zainab rehearsed the words in her head. "Madam, forgive me, but I have seen something." And with each repetition, her voice grew a little steadier, like a flame learning not to flicker in the wind. Cathy Anderson had long believed her mansion was a sanctuary, a place where marble floors, perfumed air, and the laughter of staff made walls against the chaos of Lagos. But on this night, the sanctuary trembled with an unspoken weight. And when Zainab finally knocked on her study door, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles paled, Cathy looked up from her laptop with tired eyes that softened at once. Because she had learned to recognize the difference between a servant who sought permission to speak and one who carried a burden too heavy to hide. "Come in," she said gently, setting aside her pen. And Zainab stepped forward, knees almost buckling, voice low but steady as she whispered, "Madam, forgive me, but I have seen something. If I am wrong, fire me. But if I am right, please don't drink anything he brings." Cathy stilled, the words cutting the silence sharper than any blade, and though her lips curved into a faint, practiced smile, her eyes narrowed just enough to reveal the storm inside. "Who?" she asked, her tone calm, deliberate, and Zainab dropped her gaze to the polished floor, whispering the name she feared would seal her fate. "Tonny." A long pause stretched, broken only by the patter of rain beginning to knock against the windows. Cathy leaned back slowly in her chair, fingers steepled under her chin, studying the young maid with a surgeon's patience. "Why do you say that?" she asked. And Zainab poured out the story. The overheard voices in the guest suite, the talk of a microdose, the promise of grief on Friday, the spoon that tarnished in the tea. Her words tumbled like stones, heavy and undeniable. And Cathy listened without blinking, her composure carved from years of facing men who doubted her strength. Yet something in her eyes softened when Zainab finished, as if the maid's trembling honesty had struck a chord deeper than fear. At last Cathy exhaled, rising from her chair, pacing once across the study, her silk robe whispering against the marble. "You are brave to speak, and very foolish, because this is the kind of house that eats brave girls," she murmured. But her tone was not dismissive. It was warning, protective, almost maternal. She glanced at the portrait of her late father on the wall, then back at Zainab. "If I accuse Tonny without proof, the world will call it jealousy, the board will sniff weakness, and Friday's launch will collapse under scandal. But if he truly plans what you say—" Her voice trailed, heavy with thought. Zainab's heart thudded, silence pressed between them like another presence. Then Cathy crossed to her safe, unlocked it, and drew out a small black key fob. Pressing it into Zainab's trembling hands, "This arms the dash and cabin mics in the Bentley," she said quietly. "Tomorrow night, when Tonny takes me to the board dinner, you will ride along. You will listen. If we're right, we'll have proof the sun itself can't burn away." Zainab's breath caught. Her fingers closed around the device as though it were both a lifeline and a chain, for with it came responsibility that could not be undone. Cathy's eyes lingered on her, calm but fierce. "Do not falter, Zainab. You may have walked into this mansion as a maid, but tonight you stand as witness. If you fear anything, fear silence, for silence will bury us all." And with that she dismissed her softly, leaving Zainab trembling in the corridor, the weight of both fear and hope pressing against her chest, knowing that the choice she had made would bind her fate to Cathy's in ways neither of them could yet imagine.
The city glittered that evening as the Bentley rolled out of the mansion gates, headlights slicing through the restless Lagos night. And though the car's leather seats cradled her like a throne, Zainab sat stiff in the front beside the driver, her heart pounding so loudly she feared Tonny might hear it from the back seat where he sat with Cathy, his hand resting casually on her arm as though affection were second nature and not a disguise for darker intentions. The small black key fob Cathy had pressed into Zainab's palm now lay hidden in her apron pocket, its light faintly blinking, and she kept one hand over it as though guarding a flame from wind, listening intently to every word drifting from the back seat. At first, Tonny played the doting husband perfectly, praising Cathy's vision for the robotics program, reminding her to smile for the cameras, telling her she was the future of Nigeria's philanthropy, and Cathy returned his words with polite nods and careful laughter, her voice warm enough to fool any outsider. But Zainab had spent days studying the difference between Cathy's true joy and her performance, and tonight her laughter had a hollow note, as if her soul itself braced for betrayal. When the Bentley stopped at a traffic light, Tonny's voice lowered, velvet covering steel, and he said, "Friday must go perfectly. No distractions, no noise, just grief, clean and permanent." Cathy's response was calm but sharp, a surgeon's slice. "Like your gambling debts, Tonny, or the partners you keep hidden?" He gave a little laugh that did not touch his eyes. "Don't talk nonsense, darling." That phrase, "don't talk," hit Zainab like a fist, echoing the napkin's warning, and she pressed the fob harder, ensuring every syllable was captured. She noticed something else, too, a small metallic clink each time Tonny shifted in his seat, a rhythm she recognized from her cousin's workshop, where auto-injectors rattled in pockets like guilty secrets. The realization froze her blood. He carried the weapon with him now, close as breath. The rest of the ride passed in a haze of polite conversation layered with menace, and by the time they returned to the mansion, Cathy walked inside smiling for the staff, but her eyes met Zainab's for a brief moment, an unspoken agreement that what they now held was evidence enough to burn through shadows. Alone in the pantry later, Zainab downloaded the audio and replayed it in trembling silence. The words were slippery, suggestive but not explicit, enough to raise suspicion but not yet to convict. Yet it was the clink, the damning rhythm of a vial in a pocket that convinced Tonny's plan was real, and she whispered to herself, "He means to do it at the launch, in front of everyone, so grief becomes a performance and the company becomes his." Fear gnawed at her, but so did resolve, and with shaking fingers she drafted a second plan, this one not just to listen, but to stop him outright, calling upon a friend from Ajagunle who worked in a phone repair kiosk and owed her a favor, a friend who knew how to turn scraps of tech into weapons of light. The night pressed heavy around her, but within it flickered the first glimmers of defiance, small winds, omens of a larger storm. Friday dawned humid and restless, the kind of Lagos morning where the air itself felt like it was waiting for something to break. And while the mansion buzzed with preparations for the robotics launch, Zainab slipped quietly into the underground garage under the pretense of restocking bottled water, her eyes darting over the line of polished vehicles that gleamed like sleeping beasts. And she moved with the precision of someone who had scrubbed every inch of this place and knew where shadows liked to hide.
Crouching beside the armored SUV Cathy was meant to use, she ran her fingers along the brake lines as her cousin had once taught her, testing for cracks or tampering. And though everything felt intact, her instincts told her not to stop. So she shifted to the backup sedan Tonny had mocked as overkill, and there her stomach dropped. Just above the wheel well, tucked neatly behind the splash guard, was a fresh metal clamp biting into the hydraulic hose, nearly invisible unless you bent low with the eyes of someone desperate to see. The sight made her blood turn to ice, because she knew that clamp was no accident, but sabotage. A wound waiting to bleed the brakes dry when Cathy's car rushed across the bridge Tonny had promised would be part of today's route. Her hands shook as she pulled out her battered phone, filming the clamp and the faint smear of grease around it, smudges that might hold fingerprints. Then she carefully tugged the clamp free with a rag, slipping it into a plastic bag she had tucked into her apron. Just then, the heavy sound of footsteps echoed against the concrete, and Zainab's pulse raced. She slid under the sedan, the smell of oil and dust filling her nostrils, and held her breath as Tonny's polished shoes entered her view. He was on the phone, voice smooth and confident. "Yes, the route is fixed. We'll take the bridge. Cameras love a bridge." His chuckle rang against the walls like a predator's purr. He crouched so close Zainab could smell the cologne on his suit, his hand brushing the splash guard, checking the work, and he murmured with satisfaction, "Don't talk," as if the words were a personal anthem. When he straightened and walked away, the garage door hissed shut, leaving her trembling under the car, every nerve alight with terror and fury. Crawling out, she clutched the bagged clamp against her chest like evidence of a curse, and stumbled into Auntie Grace in the corridor. Eyes wide, she blurted the truth, showing her the bag and whispering, "He wants her dead, Auntie. He cut the brakes." And the older woman went pale, crossing herself quickly, muttering, "Child, you are walking on the edge of a knife." Zainab shook her head, voice low but steady. "Then I will balance," and tucked the bag back into her apron. Outside, thunderclouds gathered, though the forecast had promised sun. And inside, the mansion ticked with tension, every clock hand moving toward an hour that promised both celebration and catastrophe.
The robotics launch began like a dream, the event hall glowing with balloons and banners, little girls in purple t-shirts buzzing with laughter as their handmade robots clattered across tables, and reporters swarmed with cameras, while dignitaries in suits filled the front row, ready to applaud Cathy Anderson's newest vision of hope. She stepped onto the stage in a lilac suit, smile bright, voice steady, as she told the children that they were not guests in the future, but its architects, her words rising like music, and the crowd responded with cheers that rolled like thunder. But in the shadows, just 2 steps behind her, stood Tonny, his hand brushing her sleeve, his smile carved too perfectly, and Zainab, dressed in her plain maid's uniform, watched from the sidelines with her tray, heart beating like a drum, because she knew the danger was here now, unfolding like a storm behind clear skies. She saw it, the glint of Tonny's ring, the subtle twist of his fingers against Cathy's arm, the way his other hand hovered near his pocket where the faint clink of glass betrayed the presence of an injector. For a moment it seemed no one else noticed, not the guests, not the cameras, not even Cathy, as she leaned forward to shake hands with a sponsor. Zainab's breath caught. If she stayed silent, Cathy would fall, and grief would become performance for the whole world. The napkin's words, "Don't talk," echoed in her mind, but instead of obeying, she stepped forward, tray in hand, and spoke clearly enough for the nearest microphones to catch. "Sir, please show your hands to security." Her voice cut through the applause, sharp as a bell.
The room shifted instantly, heads turned, whispers surged, cameras swung like predators scenting blood. Cathy froze, eyes flicking from Zainab to Tonny's ring. "Tonny?" she asked softly, her voice laced with both disbelief and dread. Tonny laughed, smooth and careless for the crowd. "Darling, your staff is dramatic," he said, but his smile wavered, his eyes flashing with something darker. Security hesitated, uncertain whether to treat this as theater or threat, until Cathy, her instincts sharper than any boardroom politician, nodded once. 2 guards stepped forward. Tonny raised his hands slowly, mockery curling his lips. But as the guards neared, he twisted, fast as a striking snake, slipping the ring into his palm. "Enough," he hissed, his voice dropping the mask of charm. "No more games." The room erupted. Guests gasped, reporters surged forward, flashes burst like lightning, and Zainab's world spun as she realized her choice to speak had cracked open the facade, turning celebration into battleground. Cathy's dream of a forest of futures trembled in the balance, and for the first time the crowd saw not just the philanthropist's smile, but the shadow stalking her steps. Chaos rippled through the hall as gasps and camera flashes collided. But Tonny moved with sudden force, shoving past the guards and wrapping his hand around Cathy's wrist in a grip that was both possessive and desperate, dragging her toward the side corridor that led to the private lounge. Reporters shouted, guests stumbled, and security scrambled, yet his speed carved a path through the confusion, leaving Zainab frozen for only a breath before instinct hurled her forward, her tray clattering to the floor as she darted after them, weaving through overturned chairs and startled children until she slipped through the service entrance into the lounge, just as Tonny slammed the main door behind him. The air inside was heavy, muffled by thick curtains, and in that silence his charm shattered like glass. His face twisted, voice low and sharp, as he hissed, "You were always going to ruin me, Catherine. You couldn't stay quiet, and now you'll pay for it." Cathy, though her wrist reddened under his grip, stood tall, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Let go, Tonny. You don't scare me anymore." He sneered, pulling something from his pocket, the faint clink confirming Zainab's worst fears. "Don't talk," he muttered, almost like a mantra, raising the injector between them. Zainab's breath caught, but she did not hesitate. She pulled the small, battered phone from her apron, the one her friend at the kiosk had wired into the building's sound system, and pressed play. Instantly, the room filled with Tonny's own voice, cold and incriminating, replayed through the lounge speakers. "Microdose, Full Measure Friday, Bridge, Cameras Love a Bridge, Don't Talk." The words echoed like a curse, undeniable, and Cathy's eyes locked onto the evidence, while Tonny's face drained of color. He tried to laugh, brittle and forced. "That proves nothing," he spat. But Zainab stepped forward, lifting the plastic bag with the brake clamp inside, her hands trembling, but her voice firm. "This does. You cut the brakes." Cathy's eyes flicked to the evidence, then back to Tonny's trembling hands. "What's in your palm, Tonny?" she demanded. His mask cracked. With a sudden snarl, he lunged, shoving Cathy aside and aiming the injector at her shoulder. Cathy twisted, her years of quiet discipline turning into shark instinct, and the injector clattered to the marble floor. In the same moment, Tonny shoved again, this time knocking Zainab hard into the wall. Pain burst through her ribs, but she staggered up, vision swimming, just as the guards pounded at the locked door. Tonny's gaze flicked toward the wide window, 3 floors above the garden, where reporters still buzzed like vultures. He grabbed a chair, swung at once, and the glass shattered outward, hot air and city noise rushing in. "If they want a show, I'll give them one." He yanked Cathy toward the broken frame, the wind tugging at her suit, shards glittering like cruel stars around them. Zainab's heart roared in her ears. This was the edge, the precipice where everything would either shatter or survive, and she knew that silence could no longer shield anyone.
Wind howled through the broken window, carrying the roar of Lagos traffic 3 floors below, and Tonny dragged Cathy onto the narrow ledge, his grip iron around her wrist, his face contorted into something unrecognizable, part fear and part rage, while flashes from the crowd of reporters outside sparked like lightning as they aimed their lenses upward to capture every second of the unfolding nightmare. "Let them watch," Tonny spat, voice rising above the chaos. "They'll finally see that I was the one in control all along." But Cathy, though her balance wavered on the hot stone, did not beg, her voice steady as she met his eyes and said, "You were never in control, Tonny, not of me, not of this company, not even of yourself." And her words hit him harder than the wind, striking at the hollow pride that had gnawed at him for years. Zainab, staggering to her feet inside the lounge, ignored the pain lancing through her ribs and climbed through the shattered frame after them, her bare feet scraping the stone as she stepped onto the ledge, her heart pounding, but her voice steady with the courage born of desperation. "Sir," she called, each syllable clear, "this is where you fall twice, once from this roof and once from every lie you've told." Tonny's eyes flicked toward her, wild and desperate, his other hand twitching near his pocket, but the distraction loosened his grip just enough for Cathy to wrench her arm free. Zainab lunged forward, hooking her arm around Cathy's waist and yanking her back toward safety, but Tonny's hand shot out, clamping onto Zainab's wrist, and for a heartbeat they all hung there between sky and ground, a fragile chain of bodies trembling over the drop. Below, the crowd screamed, their voices carrying upward like a wave, and just then, Folu, Cathy's assistant, activated the building's exterior speakers with the audio Zainab had captured. Tonny's voice poured into the night sky, damning and inescapable. "After Friday, everything will be easier, just grief, clean and permanent." The words echoed across the gardens and streets, projected on the massive event screen where the world could see, and Tonny's eyes widened as he realized his secrets had become spectacle. His grip faltered, his balance wavered, and with a final desperate glare, he slipped backward not into silence, but into a canopy 2 floors below, the impact shattering the illusion of his untouchable control. Security surged into the lounge, dragging Cathy and Zainab back inside, away from the jagged edge. And though Zainab's chest burned and her wrist ached, she clutched Cathy tightly, knowing that for once she had chosen to speak, and in that choice had turned the tide of a night that could have ended in tragedy. Yet as the sirens wailed and cameras flashed, the maid from Ajagunle understood something deeper. This was not the end, but the beginning, for men like Tonny did not vanish with a single fall, and the shadow he carried would not fade so easily.
Evening draped itself over Lagos in hues of gold and crimson as police cars and ambulances crowded the mansion's drive, their flashing lights painting the marble walls with restless color. And Cathy Anderson, bruised and scowling, was wheeled out under guard, his once immaculate suit torn, his charm stripped bare, the cameras catching every angle of his disgrace, while reporters shouted questions he could no longer answer with a smile. Cathy stood at the entrance, her lilac suit dusted, her face pale but steady, and beside her, with bandaged wrist and scraped feet, stood Zainab, the maid who had refused silence, her presence like a quiet flame in the midst of chaos. Inside the mansion, staff whispered, wondering how such betrayal could bloom in a house built on wealth and promise. But Cathy silenced them with a single raised hand. "This is Zainab," she declared firmly, her voice carrying through the hall. "She is no ordinary maid. She is the reason I am alive today. From this moment, she is under my protection, and she will be treated with the respect she has earned." The words fell like stone into water, rippling through the staff and guests alike.
And for the first time, Zainab felt the weight of shame that had clung to her since Ajegunle, lifting, replaced by something unfamiliar and frightening: dignity. That night, Cathy led her into the east wing, into a bedroom filled with soft sheets and clean air, a room so unlike the crowded quarters she had known that Zainab hesitated at the threshold, whispering, "Madame, I don't belong here." Cathy touched her shoulder gently. "Zainab, after today, you belong wherever truth is needed, and truth is needed here." Alone later, lying on the bed with tears slipping quietly into the pillow, Zainab thought of her mother's words, "Honesty keeps the door open even for the poor," and realized she had walked through that open door, not with wealth, but with courage. Outside, the city buzzed with gossip, some calling her a hero, others dismissing her as lucky, but none could erase what had happened. A poor maid had stopped a rich man's betrayal with nothing but her eyes, her courage, and her refusal to stay silent. And though shadows lingered, the trial ahead, the enemies Tonny had courted, there was light too. Cathy's gratitude, the children's futures, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest voice can crack the loudest lies. So the story ends where truth begins, in the choice to speak when silence is safer, and in the reminder that no house, no matter how glittering, can survive if built on secrets. And if you believe that courage, even from the least expected places, can change the course of destiny, share this story, subscribe, and let others hear it too, because tomorrow may bring another secret, another silence, and another voice brave enough to break it.